What I want to talk about today is living through nature. So I want to show more or less how recent sciences and scientific consensus about the interdependence between human beings and nature or the environment, how this can be informed by Japanese philosophy. And in particular, I will speak of a Japanese philosopher that lived 800 years ago, so a long time ago, Dogen. And I will see how we can get insights from his philosophy to help us understand better the situation we are in today, and to make sense better of what's happening today to us and to the world. For that, I will start by quickly brushing over the environmental situation today, and then I will move little by little to the heart of Dogen's philosophy. Here we are. So you might have heard that today we are in a global situation of global biodiversity loss. So the IPBES estimates that there is more or less 1 million species of animals and plants that already face extinction, many within decades. So it's very quick and at a very large scale. And the drivers that drive biodiversity loss, still according to IPBES, are changes in the use of land and seas, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. These drivers are on the picture there. This picture is from IPBES Global Assessment. And these are the direct drivers, right? But behind these direct drivers, you have all the indirect drivers. It's a bit maybe weird wording, but all these social cultural institutions, the governance, the policy, and the conflict, and all these human aspects right there. And behind that, you have another thing that are the values and behaviors. And this is where you also have like philosophy, right? How we see the world, how we imagine our position as human in the world. What do you think? What do we think human is actually? And another interesting thing here is that the drivers of biodiversity loss, they are the same that drive the emergence of pandemics. This has been established by a report also by the IPBES, the workshop report on biodiversity and pandemics, but also by other reports by other institutions, for example, the UNEP zoonotic report and so on. So what's the link between human activities, biodiversity, and pandemics? It might not be obvious, but actually it's quite simple, because microorganisms, microbes, and so on, they exist, they live in the wildlife too, right? In wild animals, in ourselves too. But and so right now, human activities, like I said before, we are changing the usage of the land and of the seas. So we are using more and more land, and we are going further and further in the seas. So there are less and less habitat for many other animals and plants that exist on this planet. And it means that for the viruses and microorganisms that live within these animals and plants, they have less and less space to. So they have to look for other places to go, somehow, basically. So there are different ways in which it can jump to human. One is directly. If human beings, we enter in contact with wildlife, sometimes if it's regular contact, some microorganisms might go directly from wildlife to human beings. But another way is through domestic animals, because of course the bodies of some domestic animals might be more similar to some bodies of some wildlife. So it might be easier for some microorganism to jump there. And then because domestic animals are in contact all the time with human beings, then this gives also many opportunities or possibilities of jump again. So we call this zoonotic spillover. So why am I speaking about all this right now? It's because we might think that these changes, like climate change and biodiversity loss, we might think that they are very far away from us and that they do not impact us at all, actually. But what this says here is that even at the very global zoom out level, there is a quite direct relation. When we have loss of biodiversity, this leads to threats to our health, our societies, our well-being and flourishing. So it's really not disconnected from us. It's really not far away from us. Another interesting research is about that is trending right now, that is booming, is about the human microbiome. Because it might sound, from what I said before, that all these microorganisms, they are bad and that they are threats to us, but that's really not the case. We have within us, our bodies, millions of microorganisms. There are different estimates right now because the research is really moving quickly. So the numbers might change, the specific numbers, but more or less what we think right now is that there is maybe half of the cells in our body that do not have human DNA, and we are hosting millions, some estimates say trillions, of microorganisms, and we really depend on them. Probably the most famous example here is the microbiome in our guts, on which we depend to survive because it helps us to digest, right? So there are many different types of relationships when we think of all these species within us and outside of us, right? If we speak only of the human microbiome, we already have relationship between different species within one region inside our body. For example, in the guts. This is number one on the picture. But you also have relationship between different species in different places of our body. That's number two. Then we also might have relationship of microorganisms that move from outside to inside our body. For example, each time we breathe, we exchange some microorganisms with the air that surrounds us. And another interesting thing in the research right now that is moving, so I'm looking forward to see what we'll learn is the next year, but is that apparently these microorganisms, they play a role in how we think and especially in our moods, which means that it's very intimate somehow. It's impacting us at a very intimate level. And then, of course, as we have seen just before with pandemics and so on, we have exchanging microorganisms between human beings and also with domestic animals, with wildlife and so on. And the last point that is interesting here is that the picture on the other side, the microbial conveyor belt, because we might think that microorganisms, because they are very small, they stay in a very small area, for example, your garden, and they never move, so you always are in contact with the same microorganisms. But that's apparently really not the case, because they're very small, they are moving also a lot, like with the winds, but also with the streams, and also they are carried through migratory species. For example, birds, migratory birds, they might jump on one bird and get off on another continent, and also through our own transportation means, for example, the big ships. Right now, there are attempts in research to map the flows of microorganisms around the world, and it seems to be much more interconnected than what we have thought about. So if we step back there, it means we have like other species within our bodies, always exchanging them with outside of our bodies, and these are also somehow connected with the whole globe. So it's really a very raw level of interdependence. And it also means that our body, from the perspective of the microorganisms, it's an environment. So this reflects one aspect that is very obvious, which is that we are living from nature. This is something that's very basic, right? We need nature for food, the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the water we drink. But research that now attempts to map different ways we relate to nature, they have identified other ways in which we relate to nature. Another one is that we are living in nature, and that's more reflecting the idea of villages and cities and places and the attachment to the land and water, seasonal practices and so on. Is the idea, like in the picture here, that we are really the feet in the mud and we are planting rice. Like that's how we survive as human beings, as a society. So we are really not disconnected. We are not only living from nature, we are also living in nature. Another aspect that appears a lot in many cultures is the idea that we are living with nature. We are not alone. We are living with other living and non-living entities, and we are part of this greater context. And that can have sometimes religious connotations, but it also can give a meaning to one's life, like to imagine ourselves part of a greater story. So for example, in this picture, it's the idea of contemplation, also contemplating the moon or contemplating the landscape as something sublime or beautiful outside of us that is different from us, but that makes our life more beautiful too. Another dimension that has been identified a lot more recently, maybe in the literature, is this idea that we are living as nature, that we are imitating nature or wanting to become one with nature. It's like with the rabbits on these pictures. I invite you to find the rabbits on each picture. It's the modern human as a self, individually or collectively, and it's also related to indigenous notions of oneness or kinship, to non-dual spiritual experiences and so on. So it's really this idea that one sometimes have the experience of becoming really one with nature. So these four dimensions here, living in, from, with, and as nature, they are making up the life framework of value. And this life framework of value is tries to capture the diverse ways in which people all around the world, they value and relate to nature. The idea behind this kind of research is that if we understand better how we relate to nature, then we can adapt our ways of life to live in less self-destructive ways. When I say self-destructive ways here, it's because of what I talked about before, right? Because when we destroy biodiversity or nature, it's coming back at us, because we are so interdependent. So this idea there, that if we understand better how we relate to nature, we can have better ways of life, is the idea that's really behind all my research and all my trajectory on journeys and so on. And what I learned from exchanges, especially in East and Southeast Asia these last 10 years, is that usually views of nature, they are like mirrors. Like we cannot think nature, animals, plants, all these categories without thinking humans. And we cannot think humans without thinking nature and the world. So the ideas of nature, they are really like mirror that reflect the conceptualization or the view, how we understand human societies. So here, we might think that instead of mistaking our own reflection in the mirror for an object independent from us, like nature, and call it and fix it, we might actually want to understand our human lenses first, the tools that we use to see and think about the world and ourselves. And that is when Dogen can help us a lot, because Dogen, he dedicated all his work to build a philosophy of impermanence, that is, things are changing all the time, and not only things, but ourselves too, and interdependence. So he lived 800 years ago in Japan. He traveled a bit to China too, and he founded a new school, new at that time, school of Zen Buddhism in Japan. And all these aspects I've talked about today until now of living from, in, with, and as the world and nature can be found in Dogen's work. But another aspect can be found too, is that we are living through nature. That's what I really want to talk about today. Before going more into Dogen, I need to do an anachronism warning, because of course, Dogen lived a long time ago, so it was a completely different historical, social, cultural context. And for example, at the time of Dogen, there was no concept of nature in the sense that we have it now. Right? Even in Japanese, the word shizen for nature took the sense that it has now very recently. Like very recently, it means within the 200 years past ago. But he uses other expressions, for example, myriad of things that we will see a lot. And this could amount to today's biodiversity. So that is an interpretation inspired. And the whole talk, everything I will talk about today is inspired by one interpretation of Dogen's text. An important point, first important point from Dogen, is that he warns us that we should not be limited to human views, and that we should not think naively that what one views as water is what dragon and fishes see as water and use as water. Dogen recognized the non-neutrality of our human lenses, and he described here how we are living with other living beings who perceive the world differently from us, on how the living beings are living from and in their own environment. And he uses several lovely images. And the first one I want to go really about is the image of the fish and the bird. So he writes that fish swim through water, and swim as they may, there is no limit to the water. Birds fly through the sky, and fly as they may, there is no limit to the sky. And yet, fish and birds have never once left the water or sky. If a bird were to leave the sky, or if a fish were to leave the water, they would die instantly. For a fish, life is by means of water, and for a bird, life is by means of the sky. It's the case that life itself is also by means of birds and fish, and by means of life, birds and fish are able to be. And that's a bit complicated here. The verification practice of human life is also just like that. But what this last sentence means is that it's the same also for human life. Our human beings' condition is also like that. So we belong to a place, to our milieu, in a way that there is no clear border separating the outside from us, and that we could not even exist outside of this place or milieu we are in. Like he says, right, even if the fish were to leave water and aim at the sky, it could not find its way or attain its place in it. And that's the same for human beings. But like the fish, he swims as if as if there is no end to the water, right? He cannot even imagine that there is something beyond the water. And the warning of Dogen is that it might be the same for us, human, right now. what we see as the environment, we might not even be able to imagine what there is beyond that, or what there is different than that, because we are so inscribed and attached to the environment. But it's not only about animals and humans. Dogen also writes about the grasses, trees, and lands. He writes that like the sun, the moon, and the stars, they are mine. And because they are mine, they are living beings. And because they are living beings, they have the Buddha nature. So I will not go into the Buddha nature talk, but human beings for Dogen also have the Buddha nature. For him, we are all somehow the same, right? And interconnected at the same level. A last image from Dogen is the image of the river. And you might have heard already of the image of the river, because there is a very famous saying in Western worldviews about that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man, right? Because the water is flowing, and ourselves we are changing. So it's actually not possible to step in the same river twice. And it's not possible for the same person to step in the same river twice. That's from Heraclitus. It's a long, long, long time ago. So the image of the river is very strong for showing this impermanence idea, right? But Dogen, he tells us something else with the image of the river. He speaks about the practice, and he writes, to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be verified by the myriad of things, which could be biodiversity, maybe. To be verified by the myriad of things is to let drop off the body-mind of the self on the body-mind of others. So what does this mean? One interpretation could be that there are two aspects here. One is that by carefully studying ourselves, so if we really look into ourselves and into what we are, we actually learn that the separation between us and the world is porous and artificial. And also by devoting our full attention to streams, instead of observing them from the outside as fixed objects. Really, if we devote our full attention to them, then we can understand that permanent and independent egos and things are illusions, because everything is changing. So there are two main conclusions here from Dogen's view. One is dynamic interdependence. It means it's the experience of weakening the borders between the self and the world that teaches us that the borders separating things in the world are also porous. And the second one is impermanence, and that's the last quote from Dogen. He says that if one tries to discern the myriad of things with confused assumptions about the body-mind, it can mistakenly seem as though there is one mind, one's own mind and nature are permanent. Actually, they are not, right? That's what he says, that we are always changing. Also, our own minds and body are changing. So here are a few lessons from Dogen, or from the talk in general, is that we are living through nature, the world, and diverse species. And we exist actually as nexus, like little nodes. And we exist in the midst also of these multi-species flows and processes. But we cannot separate ourselves from them, right? Because we are so made of them. And we cannot neither fully objectify them into something that we are living with, or that is so different and separated from us. And we cannot neither completely erase the differences and be one with them, or equalize us as the world, because we are still different. So in order to understand the world, we might first need to understand our human biases on diverse lenses. And in view of on these diverse lenses, it's an important point here for me, is that it's also including cultural worldviews, right? It's not only about our human biases as our human bodies and cognitive systems, but it's also how different cultures make sense very differently of the world and human beings. And so in view of the global environmental and biodiversity crisis, we should not only reconsider our relation to nature, how that's what most of the research I talked about in the beginning was about, right? Exploring and reconsidering our relation to nature. But I think we also should reconsider what we are. If we learn from Dogen or what I talked about today, we could see ourselves as ever-changing living beings that depend on natural flows and on other living beings for our very existence and well-being. So what does it mean for everyday life for each of us? Because of course our ways of life every day, what we do, our habits and so on, they influence these flows. And therefore, we have a responsibility, because we have an influence, we have a responsibility, right, in the choices we make. And here, there are many, many different options that are discussed, that I explored right now. I will mention only 3 quickly, and then I will really invite you to imagine your own action points, depending on what you are doing, your work, your position, and so on. One of the initiative that is happening more and more today is this multi-species cities initiative that encourages flow of and between human bodies and other species, with, for example, wildlife corridors and fallow areas within the cities that help people, like people who live in the city, to enter in contact with the dirt and with other environmental aspects and make exchanges of microorganisms, right? Another aspect has to do with the choices we make. And we might want to have consumption choices, aware of the flows behind the production and the production of food, for example, or the production of other products. And for instance, that might lead to a consumer choice of boycotting animal products that are produced in intensive farming, right? That could be one option. On another big booming field that is also more and more popular at the high level, for example, in the UN and so on, is the idea of One Health, una sola salud. It's this idea that in medicine, in veterinary sciences today, many different groups of researchers, they have to come to the conclusion that if we want healthy human beings, this also means that we need healthy animals and healthy environment. So these 3 aspects are completely bound together. So that's it for today. So these are just some ideas, and you might really imagine your own action points. There are so many possibilities. And if you want to continue the discussion, I will invite you to check in my website. There is also a contact form. So I would be really happy to have your comments, criticism, ideas, and suggestions, and so on. So thank you very much.